So I think the attraction to panpsychism is it's kind of a middle way. It agrees with the materialist that there's just a physical world. Ultimately, there's just particles and fields. But the panpsychist thinks there's more to the physical than what physical science reveals, and that the ultimate nature of the physical world is constituted of consciousness. So consciousness is not outside of the physical, as the dualist thinks. It's embedded in, underlies the kind of description of the world we get from physics. The typical commitment of the panpsychist is that the fundamental building blocks of reality, maybe fundamental particles like electrons and quarks, have incredibly simple forms of experience, and that the very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow rooted in or derived from this much more simple consciousness at the level of fundamental physics. So I think panpsychism is important in that regard, in bringing together the quantitative facts of physical science with the, as it were, the human truth, by which I just mean the qualitative reality of our own experience. We take the causal dynamics of physics, we hypothesize that that's filled out with certain forms of consciousness, and then at higher levels we get more complex causal dynamics filled out by more complex forms of consciousness, and ultimately we get to us, hopefully. It's not that there are two kinds of property, that mass, spin, and charge are forms of consciousness. If matter at the fundamental level just is forms of consciousness, then we can perhaps make sense of how those simple forms of consciousness in some way combine in some way to make the consciousness we know and love. That's the dream. So I think panpsychism is important in that regard, in bringing together the quantitative facts of physical science with the qualitative reality of our own experience. Mass, spin, and charge are forms of consciousness. We take the causal dynamics of physics, we hypothesize that that's filled out with certain forms of consciousness, and then at higher levels we get more complex causal dynamics filled out by more complex forms of consciousness. They do want to say there is gradations. I'm not sure conceptually I can kind of make sense of that. I mean, there are things to do with consciousness that are graded, like complexity or levels of information, but I'm not sure whether experience itself admits of degree. I sort of think something either has experience or it doesn't. It might have very simple experience, it might have very complex experience, but experience itself, I don't think it admits of degree in that sense. It's not more experience, less experience. I sort of find that conceptually hard to make sense of. The core theory is correct in its own terms, namely capturing the causal capacities of particles and fields, but then it's a further assumption whether they're the only things that are running the show. Maybe there are also fundamental causal capacities associated with systems, and then if we discover this strong emergence, then when we work out what happens in the brain, we have to look to the core theory, the causal capacities of particles and fields, and we have to look to what we know about these strongly emergent causal capacities of systems, and maybe they co-determine what happens in the system. So I don't know whether that makes sense or not. Yeah, I guess I just find it hard to shake the idea that some ways of some life goals are more worthwhile than others. And it doesn't mean, that there's one single way you should lead your life, but pursuing knowledge, helping people, pursuing your own pleasure to an extent are worthwhile things to do. It's hard to make sense of metaphysically. What could possibly ground that? How could we know about these facts? But that's the starting point for me.